Hello and welcome to End of Life University podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and thanks so much for being here with me today. In a few moments, I'll be sharing with you a wonderful conversation I had with Rabbi Steve Leder. We talk about his recently published book, The Beauty of What Remains, and we had such a great conversation. We could have gone on all day. I know I say that about lots of guests, but it's really true. We really clicked. And for me, it was very interesting to hear the perspective of a rabbi who cares for people who are dying and their loved ones and prepares funerals and eulogies for them, all people who are members of the temple where he serves. So it's a different perspective than I have as a doctor, and I really enjoyed seeing how he views death and dying and end-of-life issues compared to my own, where we intersect and where we might differ in our perspective. So I'm excited to share that with you in just a few moments. But first, I wanted to tell you about a couple of things. One is that today, the day this podcast airs, January 18th, is a National Day of Service. And I realize it may be already past for many of you listening, but this day really kicks off what is hoped to become a year of service where all of us will commit to do some sort of volunteer work during this year to help other people. And I know we're still concerned about COVID, and so we may feel somewhat limited in what we can do, but here are some examples from the website of ideas for virtual ways of being of service to others: creating cards for patients recovering from COVID-19, letter writing to seniors in nursing homes, knitting blankets for the homeless, virtual read-alouds to students, filling a virtual shopping cart for a military family, volunteering for a hotline, and hosting a grassroots virtual fundraiser for a nonprofit. So those are just a few things that we can do to be of service to our fellow humans during this year, 2021. And I think that's a great way to kick off the year. So I'm really excited to take on a little more volunteer work than I've done in the past and commit myself to that for 2021. And then along the same lines, there is a free online event, 10 Days to Activate Revolutionary Love. It's being hosted and created by Valerie Kaur, who's a lawyer, filmmaker, activist, and she is part of the peoplesinauguration.org. So they're sponsoring this 10 days of virtual conversations, music, teach-ins, vigils, around the table, family ceremonies. They will be focusing on grief and healing, justice, joy, and rising. And so it sounds very inspirational. It gets started on January 21st. So it will be a 10-day event, and it's all free, and you'll be able to tune in and listen to any of the speakers and take part in any of the events that you want during these 10 days. So I will leave a link for that in the show notes for this episode. I realize it may not be the right thing for everyone, but I feel excited about it. Again, we need some positive things to focus on here as we begin this new year. So I love the idea of focusing on love, and particularly revolutionary love, love that's challenging, love that's hard for us to do. And I'm going to come back after this interview. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So stay tuned after the interview, which we are moving on to right now. So here we go. Today, I'm so honored to have a very special guest to share with you, Rabbi Steve Leder. Rabbi Steve is the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles and the author of several books, including The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things, More Money Than Gold, the bestseller More Beautiful Than Before, and his latest book, just newly released, The Beauty of What Remains, which we will be discussing today. As a rabbi, he has presided over thousands of funerals and helped thousands of families deal with death. He is a regular contributor on the Today Show and writes regularly for Time, FoxNews.com, Town and Country, LA Times, USA Today, Los Angeles Jewish Journal, and Maria Shriver's Sunday paper, Rabbi Steve has been named twice by Newsweek magazine as one of the 10 most influential rabbis in America. So it's indeed an honor to have him here as a guest. And you can learn more about his books and his work at his website, steveleader.com. So Rabbi Steve, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Karen. It's an honor to be with you today.
Well, I absolutely love your book. Brought me to tears several times. And so I'm really eager to talk with you about it and learn more about what brought you to write this book. So I know as a rabbi, you have dealt with death and dying, but I was just curious why you were inspired to write a book about it.
The book came out of me as, in a sense, a form of an apology. Let me explain what I mean. I had been a rabbi for 30 years, helping literally thousands of people through loss, grief, death, and not just the loss that comes from death. There are many types of deaths. There's the death of a marriage, the death of a reputation, a death of a business. There are all kinds of loss. And I thought I was doing a pretty good job. I would have given myself, probably an A minus. And then my father died after a 10-year journey through Alzheimer's disease. And after my father died, I realized that everything I had been saying and teaching about loss prior to that experience of my own profound loss was just, as I say in the prologue, 1 degree shy of the deepest truth. And I wrote this book as a correction, as an apology, as an attempt to get things exactly right that before had been almost right. And that's really why I wrote the book. To me, the artful and interesting part of the book, the part that makes it something different than a self-help book, is that it's both a field guide for death and loss and grief and mourning and letting go, a book that helps people with what is happening, what do I do, what do I not do, how do I journey through this? That's part of the book. The other part of the book is really exploring the journey and the relationship between Steve Leader, the rabbi, and Steve Leader, the son. And how I had to learn to move from rabbi to son in order to be fully present for my dad and for so many others. And how to move and navigate the role stress between the rabbi and the human being, which are sometimes aligned, but sometimes not. And so the book has these parallel narratives that sometimes intersect and sometimes remain parallel. And that's really, the essence of the energy that sustains the book and drives it forward.
Yes, and I love that. I love how you have interwoven your personal stories with your dad, with the other stories in the book. And I myself really resonated with the interplay you described between Rabbi Steve and son Steve, because I experienced it myself, taking care of my own mother when she was dying, being hospice doctor Karen and daughter Karen.
Wow. So you understand this role stress very well.
Yes, very well. Though what I found out is hospice doctor Karen didn't have that much to offer to daughter Karen. There were just things I needed to go through as a daughter that I didn't understand as a doctor helping other families dealing with it. So I really resonate.
So interesting. We have the same story in a sense, and it's hard when we've been taught and become successful by using our brains that there's a time when the only thing you can use is your heart.
Mm-hmm. And for me, that time arrived 2:00 in the morning a few nights when I'm sitting up with my mom trying to figure out how do I get her back in bed because she just climbed out of bed, and I'm thinking, well, Dr. Karen doesn't have any solutions to offer. So
Yes.
daughter Karen's going to have to figure this out.
Isn't it interesting that the power that comes from the humility of decline and death?
Oh, yes.
The power that comes from death teaching us what we didn't know.
Yes. And the title of your book, The Beauty of What Remains, that still, it gives me goosebumps every time I say it, but it is such a powerful title, and it's so true.
Yeah.
And would you just talk about it a little bit so the listeners can hear that?
My father's death, we were talking earlier about that 1 degree of deeper truth. And that 1 degree of deeper truth informed my life going forward in a very beautiful way. Now, what is this really? What do I mean? I learned a lot of lessons from my father's death that have made my life more beautiful. The first and most important of which is something you would think a rabbi would know, but it takes a son or husband or wife to know, or child to know, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, no matter how many times we say, I love you, no matter how many times we hug and hold and are hugged and held by the people we love, it's never enough. Mm-hmm. It's never enough. That's the first beautiful thing that remains in the aftermath of my loss. And the next thing, which is related, of course, that death comes to teach us, is that it's who we have, not what we have, that matters, that gives our life meaning. And I am reminded of this when I visit the cemetery. I spend a lot of time at the cemetery, particularly now with the way in which COVID is savaging Southern California right now. Mm-hmm. And since my father's death, the cemetery is a powerful reminder, because I pay more attention to the headstones now, because we had to go through this exercise for my father. When you are deciding what to inscribe on someone's headstone, you are given 15 characters per line and 4 lines, and that's it. So it's a very powerful exercise and lesson in essentialism, a stripping away of everything that doesn't really matter. And look at what is left behind. I am struck by the almost total uniformity of inscriptions on headstones in cemeteries. We all get to the same place. What is on a headstone generally? Loving husband, father, grandfather, friend. Loving wife, mother, grandmother, friend. That's it. And so, despite the fact that we are raised to believe and encouraged to believe by society that a busy life is a meaningful life, it really isn't true. And it takes death to wake us up to that fact. I actually think that that's an important and beautiful realization. And it is the beauty that remains in the aftermath of death, which is, in my opinion, death is the only real teacher. The only real teacher.
Mm. And so profound right now at this time, January of 2021, when we've just been through this past year of COVID. We're not nearly through it. So much more to go through. And as you write about, death takes so much away from us. And yet what remains is what is truly beautiful.
Right. And without it being lethal, just let me ask you your opinion. You're a doctor and thoughtful and spend a lot of time on these issues. Do you think that this virus, if it lacked lethality, if it wasn't lethal, do you think we would be learning the many important lessons it is now teaching us?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it is the fact that it's confronting our whole society, our whole planet in some ways at the same time with this reality of death as a teacher. That's that's the power within it.
Yeah. Right. So I agree with you. And this is why I say so often that I think death is actually the only real teacher when it comes to leading a meaningful life. Because if we led deathless lives, imagine a deathless life. What value, what meaning, what ambition would it actually include? I think virtually nothing. I think in a sense, we would almost cease to be human. A deathless life would be a life that is something other than human. And so as painful, and I'm not for a moment dismissing the terrible searing pain that death brings us, but it is also the very thing that gives meaning and purpose to life. Kafka said, the meaning of life is that it ends. It's so true, so simple, so true. And so I think I know the pandemic, because of its lethality, is waking us up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the power and, frankly, the beauty that death leaves behind.
It's so true, because would life even seem precious to us if it didn't come to an end, if it wasn't fleeting?
No.
Would we view it as valuable at all?
Not a chance. Not a chance. Do you like artificial flowers? Nobody does.
Yeah, exactly.
And the beauty of a flower is that it fades, that it dies. That's why we're not moved by plastic flowers. They don't move us because they're not really beautiful.
So true. So painful and so true at the same time.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
Well, your book, as you said, it's such a good guidebook. It's full of a lot of really helpful information. And I enjoyed reading it so much to see a rabbi's perspective on working with people dealing with death and dying, because I have my own, the medical perspective on it. And I was hoping you'd talk about your chapter, Showing Up, and some of the advice that you have for being with someone who's dying, because it's really helpful, and it applies to everyone, whether you're a rabbi or a priest or a family member or friend or a doctor or nurse.
So remember, I was talking about this kind of apology and readjustment, and this is one of the things that I learned about being with the dying, and also being with the grieving and the mourning afterwards. I often get calls like this. You maybe do also. They go something like this: Steve, my best friend from college was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He's got 3 to 6 months to live, and I'm going back east to visit him and say goodbye. What do I say? And my answer is almost always the same and has nothing to do with what to say. I tell people 3 words: just show up. If you just walk through that door, and now here's the important part, as your authentic self, the rest will unfold as it should. And this is what I mean by showing up as your authentic self. When you show up to visit someone who's dying or someone who's grieving, they do not need or want you to put on some bad acting job for them and showing up with your long drawn face and whispering words of, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. What they need and want is for you to be with them in death who you were with them in life, because that reassures them that the bottom has not fallen out of the world. So when you walk through that door, if you're a hugger, hug. If you're a feeder, feed. If you're a joker, joke. If you're a listener, listen. If you're a hand holder, hold hands. Just be authentically who you have always been in that person's life, because that is what they need and want. The rest will unfold organically and naturally and beautifully. Even after all these years, Karen, 33 plus years, when I'm standing outside someone's front door, or I'm standing in the hallway of a hospital outside a room, I don't know what I'm going to say when I walk through the door. I just know that I need to walk through that door. I need to show up and be real. And that's it. And that's my advice to all of us who are given this opportunity to comfort people who are suffering.
And it's simple because it's such an important thing to do. It's so important that people not get lost in their fears over what would I say or how could I be with someone who's dying. As you said, to just show up, because it might end up changing your entire life if you actually come and be with someone who's dying and
Yep.
sit at the bedside.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful experience. I have never been at the bedside of someone who's actively dying who's been afraid. Not once. By actively dying, I mean, hours or a day from death. I don't mean, people who I'm 60 who think, oh, gee, I probably got 25, 30 years left and that's it. I'm talking about people actively dying. Not one of them has ever expressed fear to me about him or herself. They may have fears for their loved ones that they're not going to be okay, but they're fine. They're fine. We're the one with the problem. And the good news about this, I guess, is if you're anxious about dying, it's not your day. Anxiety's for the living.
I wrote down this quote from the book: dying makes perfect sense to the dying, but not to the living.
Right.
So we're the ones who are worried about it, but the ones who actually are in that process don't have the same anxiety and fear.
That's right. That's right. And you would know as well as anyone in the world, this is your life's work. And so I'm actually glad to hear you confirming that point of view, because that has been my experience 100% of the time.
And, I just heard from a pediatric hospice doctor who said that children who are close to dying are always ready to die and not afraid at all. But just as you said, they're afraid for their parents. And he said many times those children carry the burden of staying alive longer, as long as they possibly can, and getting treatments that they would rather not have for the sake of their parents.
Right.
Who can't bear the thought that their child might die.
Right. And, this leads us to another point in the book that I think is so helpful to so many people, which is the question I ask when I'm summoned to the ER or the ICU by a family that has to make a decision about whether to start or stop some form of intervention. And my question, there's a lot of, as you know, chaos and confusion and a lot of emotion in the room. And I try to cut through all that clutter by asking a simple question. Is this going to prolong your loved one's life, or is this going to prolong your loved one's death? Because prolonging life, that's a loving thing to do. If the respirator or the feeding tube is a bridge to a return to a quality life, then you should do it. But if it is merely elongating a person's death, that's cruel. Mm. And then, of course, the next question is always, well, how do you know? How do you know whether we're prolonging life or prolonging death? And my answer, which is the absolute truth, but not very satisfying perhaps, is you know. You just know. I remember always when Justice Potter Stewart was asked to define obscenity for the Supreme Court in a pornography case. He said, I can't define it, but I know when I see it. And that's the truth when we have to make these decisions toward the end of someone's life about whether we're prolonging life or death. You can't define it, but you know in your heart and soul whether you're prolonging life or death. And then the question is, do you have the courage to act upon what you know? That's the real question.
And I'm so happy to hear that you can address it. And again, with such clarity for families, because this is where I still see the medical profession really struggling with this idea and really not sure if it's okay to not prolong death.
Right. And yes, exactly. And part of the problem with most physicians, and I obviously, I'm very interested in your perspective on this. Most physicians won't answer the question. Most physicians, I've been in the room so many times where a family has turned to a physician and said, Karen, if this was your mother, what would you do? And the doctors duck. They deflect. They don't answer the question. They say things like, well, it's not my mother, so I really can't say, So that to me, that's that role stress where that's something I struggled with, as rabbi versus human being. In chapter 4 in the book, there's a very, very gripping, real story about my being asked by a woman with ALS whether or not she could take the compassionate care end of life medication that is legal in California. Mm-hmm. And Judaism, for those of your listeners who don't know, is categorically opposed to active euthanasia. Jewish law is categorically opposed to euthanasia, no matter how compromised or how close to death a person might be. It is considered murder. It is considered to be playing God, and it is forbidden under all circumstances. Passive euthanasia is allowed, but never active euthanasia. So there I was, called to the bedside of a woman who said to her husband, when I give you the sign, I want you to ask Rabbi Leader to come over, and I want his permission to take the drugs to end my life, and I will only do it if he says I can and should. And this happened. So she had lost her ability. Her name is Tara. She had lost her ability to speak. She, the day before I saw her, lost her ability to point to a chart with letters and spell simple words. She was suffering from oxygen deprivation. And I don't know about your feelings, Karen, but I find oxygen deprivation to just be the cruelest of deaths.
Yes.
And there she was, looking at me with pleading eyes, and her husband, whose name was Stephen, said, Rabbi, she wants to take the drugs, but she will not do it unless you say it's okay. Yes or no? Mm-hmm. And I looked at her, and then I asked them to step out into the hallway with me outside the bedroom. And I said, let me make a couple things clear. First of all, Judaism and Jewish law very clearly say the answer is no. She may not. But I'm going to walk back in there and tell her she should, because I cannot imagine showing more compassion to my dog than a human being. And that's what I did. I walked back in that room and I said, Tara, it's okay. You have my blessing. Take the medication. And then I left. A couple hours later, the phone rang at home, and I picked it up, and it was her husband, Stephen, and he said, Rabbi Leader, thank you. Tara's gone. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Leader. And as I say in the book, he was calling for Rabbi Leader, but it was Steve Leader who answered the phone. Mm. And, I led with the heart, and I privileged my humanity above my faith. And this is something I don't see a lot of doctors willing to do. They just remain within the protocols and don't really guide. Now, not all, but many. And I'm interested, Karen, how you see the doctor's responsibility when that role stress occurs, when you're being asked to step out of the role of doctor and step into the role of, what if this was your mother? How do you handle that?
Well, I think the challenge is that a lot of doctors cannot step out of the role of being a doctor, and maybe can't even relate to the idea of it being their own parent as the patient, because maybe they haven't been through it. I would say, since my mother's death, it's so much easier for me to answer that question, because I know exactly the choices that we ended up making for my mom when she was at the end of her life, and why we made the choices, why we chose to bring her home from the hospital and chose to not have the last surgery that the doctor recommended for her, because we knew what she wanted for herself. But I think a lot of doctors, there's so much in their heads, not in their hearts, and
Mm-hmm.
they can't get out of that role. And also, it's been so ingrained in us in our training that it's our responsibility to preserve life, to save lives. And so death is always viewed as a failure. And for many doctors, it's just too hard to make that shift to say, you know what, I understand why death is natural and this is the right time, and I'll step aside because this needs to happen. And it's something I think that in the medical profession we haven't struggled with enough spiritually, whereas you as a rabbi have, you're much more comfortable looking at the spiritual issue of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Even when that is not in alignment with my actual obligations to my faith. And
Yes.
that's the part where death really forced me to grow. And my father's Alzheimer's disease was such an important part of that, because I talk about this in the book. I remember one of the many times my father had pneumonia in the nursing home. And this was about 3 or 4 years before he died. And I live in Los Angeles, and I have 4 siblings who live in Minneapolis, where my father and mother live, and where my dad was in the nursing home. And when I learned about the pneumonia, I was talking to my brother about it, and my brother said, "I hope he dies." And I was shocked. Because it felt so unfeeling. But it really caused me to rethink where we were in the journey. And he was right. He was right. Now, ultimately, my dad turned that around, as he did so many times. But that was the beginning of my waking up to the fact that more is not always better.
Mm-hmm.
And that there are many things worse than dying. Many. Which is very hard to understand until you encounter one of those many things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, these are the powerful lessons we only learn one way.
It's so true. Death pushes us right to the edge of everything we know and everything we believe, and pushes us even farther than we would like to go.
That's right.
In encountering these difficult choices.
That's right. And people sometimes ask me, well, I'll never be ready. And I say to them, I level with people now in a way I did not before. I said, let me tell you something. The disease is in charge. The disease has its own rhythm and power, and it will carry you along. It will wean you from your loved one. It will bring you to your knees. The disease is in charge. And we need to go along for the ride, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in other words, let's make peace with that we cannot change. Let's make peace with our inability and lack of control. And let's go with this and not against it. There's an old saying that you can't push a river upstream.
Mm-hmm.
And death really comes to teach us that.
Mm. So true. So true. And I think the disease, as you said, the disease is in charge, and it gradually removes all of our ego attachments one by one to one thing after another, all
right.
of the ephemeral and superficial aspects of life that we thought were important.
That's right.
And so we're left with, as your title says, the beauty of what remains, because what remains is what's pure, the pure essence of who we are.
Exactly right.
Well, one thing that I really appreciated reading about, you wrote about a chapter about eulogies. Mm-hmm. And writing a eulogy, sometimes when the death has been difficult, or the person had a difficult life, and how do you write a eulogy? And that was something new for me to think about, but I realized so many patients that I've cared for, I didn't have to view that side of it as how would you go about honoring someone who had a really challenging life, or who perhaps had even been a criminal.
Yes.
But, how you as the rabbi, you have to come up with a beautiful eulogy to comfort the family. So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the counterintuitive point in that chapter is that the truth, even when it comes to a person's flaws, is paying a greater honor to that person's life than a sanitized two-dimensional picture. If you really want to honor someone's life, then you also examine and address and consider that person's faults and weaknesses, because that makes them real and human. And now, obviously, this has to be done in an extremely sensitive way and dignified way. I'll just give you a simple example so all your listeners have a sense of what I'm talking about. Let's say that, you grew up with a mother who was always in your business, who was incredibly invasive, who had real boundary issues. I might handle that by saying something like, the worst sin a parent can perpetrate upon a child is the sin of indifference. And she was never indifferent. Now, the family knows exactly what I'm talking about, and they're going to feel heard, and they're going to feel validated. But the average person listening to that eulogy at the funeral is going to think, oh, isn't that beautiful? She was never indifferent, right? Or I'll say something, for example, let's say that you grew up with a father who gambled and lost the family's money and led a double life, etc. You could say something like, it wasn't always easy to be his son, but everything he did out of love, or something like that. So you acknowledge the truth of a person's story and life, the truth of the feelings of those of us left behind in a sensitive but honest way. And then people can begin to heal because it was a real picture, not a false picture. And I think this is so important. For 13 years, I taught a course at the Rabbinical Seminary in Los Angeles. The course was called Homiletics, and it was about how to write sermons, wedding addresses, and eulogies. And this is something I really, really drill down on with the students, is the importance of telling the truth in a loving way, because that's what brings comfort to a family.
It's so true. And it goes back even to the authenticity you were talking about earlier.
That's right.
When we show up for the dying, in a way, showing up after they've died, that same authenticity is really important.
That's right. I mean, you don't want a family driving away from the cemetery saying, who was the rabbi talking about? That wasn't Dad. You don't want that.
Yeah. So true. Well, I also wanted to touch on, and you as a rabbi can really speak to this, the importance of funerals and rituals for healing, for our grief. Yeah. And the fact that right now that's something that's not able to happen regularly in the way we were used to in the past because of COVID. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, about what we're losing if we don't have our rituals and what they provide for us.
I will tell you, this might surprise you. I think funerals are better, not worse, under these conditions. Better from the perspective of the family. And I'll tell you why. Right now in Los Angeles County, we're limited to no more than 10 people allowed at a funeral, and it has to be graveside. Now, what does this mean? This means that the people at the funeral are definitionally the innermost circle of that person's life. The people who really matter. I mean, do any of us really have more than a handful of people who really matter? No, we don't. And so the family doesn't know this necessarily unless they've been through a large funeral before. These conditions are sparing them the pressure, the exhaustion, and the phoniness of being on display, of being part of a production for 300 people, of being part of something that has to be choreographed, of being something that has to start exactly on time and has to end in 45 minutes because another family's waiting for the chapel after us. There's none of that. It's only the handful of people who matter, and they have the opportunity to speak from their hearts.
Mm.
So I feel that these very small, intimate graveside funerals are far more meaningful and beautiful than funerals under normal circumstances.
Oh, that's so interesting to hear, because I hadn't thought of that before, and I haven't heard other people talk about that, but it does make so much sense. And maybe this is important learning for us as well, as we're redefining some of these rituals and rethinking how we do them for future times, even after COVID.
Well, isn't that interesting? We'll see. We'll see how quickly things return to their default settings.
Yes.
That's really the challenge of this pandemic is, are we going to come out of it empty-handed? Or are we going to use what we've learned to ennoble and change our lives? And the jury's out.
So true. So true. I guess I'm in the camp of thinking, oh, of course, this is going to change everything. We're all going to grow so much. And on the other side of it, we'll be like it'll be like a new world. But I realize that's maybe
we'll see. We'll see.
You're right. We humans are slow learners.
Yes, we are. But I'll tell you, if anything can teach us, it's death.
Yes, so true. And it's right in our faces right now in so many ways. Oh gosh, there's so much more I wanted to cover, but I'll move ahead to the chapter that I honestly was like in tears throughout the entire chapter was the last chapter, The Afterlife of Memory, yes, which was just so beautiful. And the stories you told in it were so touching. So I really want to talk about that, about the importance of our memories and how our loved ones live on with us in our memories.
Yeah. And let's talk, so I was talking about the things that I learned that I had to go 1% deeper. And one of them is memory. We always say, or many times we say in the face of death, after a person has died, may his memory be a blessing. She'll live on in your memories. But there's a deeper truth about memory, which is there's a duality to memory. Because the truth about memory is, yes, it's beautiful. And it really, really hurts. It's both. In the book, I say it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time. That's memory. And we have to know, well, I shouldn't say have to. It helps to know that. It helps to know that memory is beautiful, but it's also going to hurt. And that enables us, I think, to delve more seriously and fully into memory. And memory, the amazing thing to me about memory is, in my view, it is really what separates us from other species and animals. Because, first of all, only human beings live with the realization that they're someday going to die. We do a lot to deny that and tuck it down, push it down into the basement of our psyches. But we all know at some level, while we're living, that we're going to die. And this isn't true for animals. They live purely in the moment. And the other thing is that human beings have this ability. I heard a neurobiologist once label it as being homo duplex, meaning we can dwell in two dimensions of time at the same time. We have the power and ability to willfully, consciously summon the past into the present and then carry it with us into the future. Only human beings can do that. And this is such a helpful comfort when we miss the people we love who have died. We can willfully summon them. I do it every morning. I have a picture of my dad in my closet. And every morning when I get dressed, I say a prayer and I look at that picture and I think about my dad. And we can all do this. It could be a picture, it could be a poem, you can light a candle, you can pause to meditate. It can be a certain place you choose to go to remember. But we have this extraordinary gift to bring our loved ones back to life. And that is an afterlife, a beautiful afterlife that dwells within us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is such a gift. I would be so heartbroken if death meant in its aftermath we had to have amnesia for the ones we love. What a terrible waste and curse that would be.
Mm. Yes, and the stories over and over again, you can see how many people end up making this meaning of their loved one's death through just the little mementos, things that they keep and cherish from their loved one. And I know you have your father's prayer shawl.
Yes. My father's prayer shawl, which I wear on the holiest night of the Jewish year, the eve of Yom Kippur. And I feel him on my shoulders. I feel him all around me. And it's these little things. That's probably the least valuable thing my father left me in a material sense. But it is my greatest inheritance.
Mm. So sweet. And there was a precious story about a young woman who, with her mother, bought a red dress that a toddler would wear.
Yes,
this one really brought tears to my eyes as a mom.
It's so beautiful. That story is by Cheryl Strayed in a beautiful book called Tiny Beautiful Things. And she talks about how when she was in her 20s and single, she and her mother were at a kind of a garage sale, and Cheryl picked up this little red velvet dress, and she was enamored by it. There was something about it. And her mother said, "Do you want it?" And she said, "No, I don't have any kids." And her mother said, "Well, put it away for later." And Cheryl Strayed writes, I had no intention of getting married or having children. And, my mother was annoying me. And then Cheryl Strayed said, "Well, I don't have any money. It costs $1. I don't have $1. Her mother said, "I do." And her mother bought the dress for her. And Cheryl Strayed took it home and put it in a box and didn't see it for years. And then she had a little girl. And she found the dress in a box. And she said to herself, "My mother bought a little red velvet dress for a granddaughter she would never know. My mother bought a little red velvet dress for a granddaughter she would never know." And then she said, "It is so heartbreaking and it is so beautiful."
Wow.
And right. And these are the things, Karen, it is these tiny, beautiful things. If the pandemic has taught us all anything, it's that a little is a lot. And a little is a lot is a beautiful way to live. And what her mother was doing was what I call living as a good ancestor. If you were to ask me as a religious, spiritual person, how do we live a meaningful life? I would say live your life trying to be a good ancestor. We don't think of ourselves as ancestors, but every one of us is an ancestor, just not yet. So the question is, can you live while you're alive as a good ancestor for long after you're gone?
Mm.
That line of cleaning products called Seventh Generation? Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
Do you know where that comes from?
Well, no, tell us.
So that phrase, Seventh Generation, comes from the law of the Great Iroquois Nation, a Native American tribe, which says, when the elders make a decision for the tribe, they must consider the impact of that decision on the seventh generation to follow. What a way to live.
Mm.
What an ennobling way to live.
Focusing on, as you said, how can I be a good ancestor for those who will come after me, instead of being upset about what our ancestors left for us.
Right. Or let us be grateful for what they left for us.
Yes.
and do as well or better ourselves.
Exactly. And that's a huge calling for us right now as we're going through this pandemic. Can we get through this and be good ancestors for our offspring that will come?
Right. That's exactly right. And death is the great opportunity to really, really consider our lives.
So true. Well, Rabbi Steve, I know that you have other places to be, so I could talk to you all afternoon. I'm sure.
Thank you. And you are kindred spirits, but I do have to go, unfortunately.
Where can people buy your book, The Beauty of What Remains?
The Beauty of What Remains was released last week. You can buy the book, obviously, on Amazon, your local bookstore. You can go to my Instagram and follow me and get the book on the links in the bio. My Instagram is at Steve_leader, LEDER, at Steve_leader. Follow me there and Amazon and your local bookstore. Buy local if you can.
All right. Thank you so much, Rabbi Steve, for being your authentic self and sharing so much today.
Thank you. And thank you for the beautiful work that you do.
Oh, thank you. So welcome. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Rabbi Steve. As I said, we really hit it off and we could have talked much longer. And one of the things Rabbi Steve talked about is what kind of ancestors will we be for our offspring in the future, not just our own children, but for 7 generations ahead of us. What kind of ancestors will we be? I thought that was a wonderful question, and I've never pondered that before. And so as we're looking at things like I was talking about the 10 days of revolutionary love, it seems to me that love is the legacy that would have the greatest impact on the generations that are to come beyond us. And that love is truly the best focus we could have right now in 2021. I also have learned through my work with patients at the end of life that love is what really matters to patients who are on their deathbeds. Love turns out to be the most important thing that we can pursue while we're alive here on this planet. So I just wanted to mention that the best way to bring more love into the world is actually to first work on yourself. To figure out, where do you not love yourself? What parts of you have you rejected? What parts of you do you loathe, you can't stand, that you don't even want to look at or admit that are parts of you? It's essential that we start there so that we can make ourselves more whole. We can heal our own wounds. We heal our own flaws and imperfections and learn to embrace them and to love them as part of ourselves. That is actually what empowers us to bring great love into the world. So while we're learning about how to be better at loving everyone else, it's essential that we start with figuring out, how do I love me? And looking first at everything that I don't love about myself. That's the place to begin. So journal about it, pray about it, meditate about it, do some active work on how you can embrace your own shadow and become more whole and more complete. That's how you will bring the most love to the world, which will have an impact right now, but also for the next 7 generations. And when I say in my tagline at the end of every episode, we're here for love, what I mean is that truly is the most important purpose for any of us to be here, is to learn how to love deeply ourselves, others, how to love the unlovable, how to love the planet that we're on, how to love our own lives, even though they're filled with pain and suffering at times. How can we bring fearless love to this world? That is what we came here to learn. So I try to remind you of that every single week. I will be back in 1 week with another episode, so be sure and come back every Monday to hear the latest interview or solo episode that I have to bring you. If you like this content, I hope that you'll share it with someone else who might also benefit from listening. You can also help support the podcast by leaving a review on the platform wherever you happen to be listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher, Spotify, any of those platforms. You can leave a review for the podcast, and that helps it rise up in the rankings so that more people will see it if they're searching for this type of content. And I'd also like to thank all of you who have been supporters of the podcast on my page at Patreon, patreon.com/EOLU. Your contributions every month have made a huge difference and are really helping me financially to keep the podcast on the air, but also helping me emotionally and spiritually to know that there are people out there listening who appreciate the content that I create. So thank you so much. And this week I want to thank S. Robertson, who signed up as a new patron. Your support is much appreciated. So until we come together again next week, I'll remind you once more that we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your one precious life. Bye-bye.